that camera live, and he's getting the feed up. So this is Dr. Zachary Porcu, and as I mentioned in my email multiple times, he's the author of Journey to Reality. So a little over a year ago now, almost 2 years ago, I came across the book. It was recommended in our OCA clergy group. So I grabbed it and read it, and it impressed me. It felt like something anybody at any level could relate to. And so it became required reading for our catechumens. And this whole last academic year, you could say, last fall, last spring, it was something that even Nicholas was teaching here for all of our catechumens. So we're going to continue using it as a core text for all of those coming in. So I think it's crucial to understand that difference between the secular and the sacramental life. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to you to give us a little introduction.
Thank you. So I think we're gonna do this in two parts. So we'll talk about secular society first, and then in the second part we'll do some sacramental, to go a little deeper in the sacrament. Everyone read the book? I don't want to retread one person. Okay, one. Not everyone, so I don't want to retread too much. It's always the teacher's fear that he's just repeating things the students all know while they doze off. So we can move. We can go deeper as you like. I'll have some time for Q&A to make that happen. So the first part is secular society. So So, something I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is, it's a little bit in the book, but at the end, is those of you who read it, you know that I talk about people, where then did secular society come from? How do we understand what it is in its core kind of commitments? And therefore, what do we do about it? How do we live as Orthodox Christians in a secular world? So, today, for you, my new material, I want to elaborate more on kind of what we really mean by secularism, and I want to offer the perhaps provocative idea that what we mean by secularism is kind of the late/last stage of what we're used to calling Western civilization. So something, I don't know how many converts are here, but something that I'm a catechist, and so something we deal with a lot is talking about, well, what is Western civilization? And in a lot of our education, a lot of our enculturation, we think, okay, well, Western civilization means something like Christianity. Christianity promotes and is the core of perhaps Western civilization, or it's the thing that makes Western civilization so great, or right? So, I mean, people will take this, if you ask Catholics or Protestants, they'll take that in different ways. But as I've been reading and thinking the last 6 months or so, something I increasingly have been telling my catechumens is, and you hear this, like Orthodoxy is not Western, Orthodoxy is Eastern. What does that mean? Is it compatible with Western what? With which Western ideas? And so what I want to offer to you is a little bit of a narrative about a better way to think about Western civilization. And if you hear people talk about what is Western civilization, they'll often start with, Plato, Aristotle, Homer, the Greeks, the Romans, and the narrative is that there's kind of this the pagans, the virtuous, but they're not Christ yet, and they discover all these great ideas, and those ideas continue, and then they culminate in something like modern Western civilization now, found in America, and the American founders will cite Aristotle and Cicero, these classical founders, and there's a Catholic influence, and they'll say, well, Augustine, and Thomas Aquinas, and they bring in all of these figures from the medieval world and from the classical world. But what I want to offer to you is the idea that the ancient world, the classical world, the Greeks and Romans, all of that isn't really connected to what we now think of today as Western civilization, especially what we now think of as Americanism or American civilization. So the idea is something like this. Our civilization, of which America is kind of the crest of the wave, really is born in about 1000 AD. And that's when some scholars will say that the West actually begins. It doesn't begin with Plato and Aristotle. begins at about 1000 AD. And now, what happens in 1000 AD that's significant to you in church history? Schism, right? And so what I would submit, if I was going to give you an explanation of what the West is, I would say that the West starts in about 1000 AD. And it starts with something, with the events and the cultural movements and theology, whatever, that sort of culminates in the schism. And then the definition of Catholicism that comes out in the Middle Ages. There's all of these, what we would say, are new doctrines that come into Catholicism. And there's a very distinctive religion that is born in this period, which you might call German Catholicism or just Catholicism proper. And what the people I've been reading right now are saying, and it's what I've been thinking, that this is really the beginning of the West, Catholicism. And Catholicism, if you guys have been in the Catholic Church, the aesthetic is so different. Aren't you just struck by how the aesthetic is very different? Our aesthetic is bright, it has all this gold everywhere. And the Western aesthetic, it's kind of dark. Like the cathedral, it's shadowy. It goes up into a ceiling that you can't see. It has all these lattices, and it's not covered with golden faces of the saints. I mean, there's iconography, but there's statues, and that's a little different. So the whole aesthetic of the thing is Gothic. It's got this kind of Germanic northern feel to it. And I think what we would say in Orthodoxy is that that is a different religion from ours. The aesthetic expresses itself differently. And of course, the doctrines are different. There's different takes on married clergy, or there's the Filioque Creed. Pick your example of how this works. But they really just seem to me to be different religions, and therefore what we're looking at are different civilizations. So let's chart a little bit of the history of the West. How do we describe it? Let's say the West does start in 1000 AD with Catholicism as the high religious expression. What do you get after that? You get scholastics, maybe Thomas Aquinas, or any of the scholastic Catholic names, authors that are writing at this time. And that goes on for a few centuries, but then what happens in the 1500s? You get Reformation, and you get Protestantism. And so, a really, I think, compelling way to look at the Reformation is that it is a type of Catholic heresy. And Luther and Calvin and these guys they are very scholastic. Luther is a Catholic monk. If you read Calvin and all, he's very scholastic, the way he writes and the way he thinks. Meaning, they're really the sons of a Catholic Western culture. Come back to this. So that's sort of the second movement. I'm going to be radically oversimplifying this, so don't get too hung up on the details. But let's look at it in terms of general movements. You've got Catholicism as this kind of first movement in the Western story, and then you've got the Reformation and Protestantism as this kind of second movement in the Western story. And it's still very Western. You notice all the things that Catholics and Protestants are arguing about all kind of fall in line on the same discussions, the same, right? Well, how do you understand grace in this way? What about salvation this way? What about free will in this way? And all of these questions are framed with very Western ways of thinking about the world. I remember there was this little book that was a series of talks between a Catholic, an Orthodox, and a Protestant, and it was supposed to be, it's called Convergence of Traditions. I don't know if anybody's heard of this text. The reason you would hear about it is because Alexander Schmemann wrote the Orthodox essay, gave the Orthodox talk. He was at Oxford. And, for the Catholic outlined his position, the Protestant outlined his position. But then when Schmemann starts, he starts by saying, look, all of these arguments that the Catholic and the Protestant are having, we just don't have a lot of those arguments. The sort of step zero kind of initial problem that Orthodox have talking to Catholics and Protestants is we just don't even define any of the terms the same way. We're sort of not having the same conversation. And so the Catholic and the Protestant, if you get this little ecumenical gathering, they'll argue and then they'll turn to the Orthodox person like, what do you think about this very particular issue? And the Orthodox person is like, we never had that problem. We don't even have those terms. We don't even think think in those ways about this even issue that you're having. And his point was that Orthodoxy has a totally different history and a totally different trajectory. And he doesn't use these words, but the way I would translate that is Orthodoxy is not Western. It's not caught up in these very particular Western concerns. We'll give some examples of those in a minute here. So where are we in there? You have Catholicism as the first movement of the West, and you have the Reformation as kind of the second movement of the West, but it's still along Western lines. It's still thinking in a Western way. It's still trying to wrestle with Western problems. Then what happens after that? Well, the Reformation, some of you know maybe, it leads to this giant thing called the Wars of Religion, the 30 Years' War. Europeans go to war against each other. If you've heard about this, I mean, they don't really teach this in school that I'm aware of that much. Maybe you'll get a line or two about it. But something that you really have to appreciate is that this was kind of the world war of the time. It was all of Europe, and it was extremely bloody. It's comparable to the World War in terms of the percentage of the population that was killed during these wars. I think half the population of Germany died during the 3 Years' War. Half. Okay? So it was a complete disaster in that sense, and nothing was resolved at the end of it. Meaning, which religion, it was the way that a secular person or an atheist will pitch this war to you is they'll say, see, religion's so divisive, religion causes conflict, religion leads to violence, look at the wars of religion in Europe at this time. And that's, I think that's fair. Because when you look at it, what you see is not people really fighting and killing each other over religion. What you see is the secular nation states, which are just emerging their own identity, German national identity, Italian national identity, French national identity. They're using religion as a kind of shorthand for other national identities, and then killing each other over this. So if we're going to persecute Anglicanism, well, it's like, what does that mean? That means we're persecuting the British. It's a shorthand. And the clue that you know that this is not really about religion, but about national identity, is that in this conflict, which is supposedly a Protestant versus Catholic conflict, France decides to reform. France is a Catholic nation, but they side with the reformers because of political interest. That's a big clue that these conflicts are political. They're not really religious. And like at the end of this, nothing is resolved about the moral religious order of Europe. What's resolved is this pithy phrase in Latin, which basically amounts to your region, your religion, something like that. Meaning if it's France, it can be Catholic, if it's Britain, it can be Anglican. Everybody just let each nation have their own religious identity and leave it alone. And what this means is that the sort of transnational Catholic identity that kind of bound Europe together and gave a single religious feeling is now been compartmentalized into all these different little nation states, this atomization of Europe. So then you have this, it's like, okay, so is it Protestant? Well, it's secular. And the reason I say that is because now in Europe, you cannot really have one religion that everyone shares. Because Catholicism doesn't play that role anymore. So now religion actually has to become a matter of personal preference or local culture. And so therefore, statecraft politics necessarily becomes secular, because you have to find some things that we can all agree on to run society that are not religious. What can we all agree on? Well, reason and secular ideas, secular argumentation, science. We can all agree on science. If you or I disagree on the boiling point of water, we could just go in the kitchen, use a thermometer, and then the problem is solved. I can prove it to you. That's something we can all agree on. This is what we've learned from Europeans at this time. We've learned that we can't all agree on religion. We'll just have a 30 Years' War, and then nothing will be resolved. We can all agree on science. We can all agree on reason. And so, what you get a scientific revolution, and you get functionally, secular enlightenment culture. about, so that's the third movement in our story. Catholicism, then Protestantism, then the Enlightenment, secularism. And what's striking to me about this kind of third process, this third stage in our movement, is that secularism, if you're familiar at all with these Enlightenment guys, they're triumphalist about reason and science, we're going to fix everything, we're going to have the right society, and religion was the problem. They kind of scapegoat all the problems on religion. I'm overgeneralizing, but by the time you get to Voltaire, it's quite there. And they're going to use reason and science to fix society. And what strikes me about that impulse is how very Catholic it is, in fact. Because it is what? Grounded in a certain way of thinking about reason. We're going to get these smart people, and we're going to work out all the rational problems, and then we're going to implement that as a societal solution. That reminds me of scholasticism. Right? And so there's this through line, Catholicism, Protestantism, to Enlightenment, secular humanism, that has the same kind of Western sense of the world, that there are these engineering problems, we can solve with reason, scientific and technological advancement is a very Western kind of feeling, if you will. Something most people don't know is that the Middle Ages, and you probably heard them described as the Dark Ages, nothing happened, everyone was illiterate and stagnation. This is not true. This is a secular humanist kind of propaganda. The Middle Ages was a period of incredible technological advancement. There's all these things that, like crop rotation and the heavy plow and water mills and windmills and all of these things that are just crazily being invented during the High Middle Ages. Things that you don't think about because you don't go and interact with a windmill grinding your wheel every day. I don't think. So some of these things are removed from us, so we don't think about them. But you have to appreciate how innovative things like crop rotation or the heavy plow. I don't even really know what a heavy plow is, to be frank with you, right? Because I'm that removed from it. But those things were massive innovations in the medieval period, not to mention all the literacy of the copying of manuscripts from the classic world and amongst them. So it is, in fact, a period of discovery, invention, and innovation. And it's rooted in a very particular Western concept of reason, which is what? Let me give you a little contrast to the pagan. The ancient Greeks had the capacity to invent a lot of things. They just chose not to. You think of Plato and Aristotle as being brilliant, and they were. But we know through some manuscript evidence that it seems like the ancient Greeks discovered the principles needed to make steam technology. But they looked at it and said, that's cute, or something is the equivalent. Western man would have thought, we can make steam ships. We can revolutionize commerce. We can conquer the world. That's a very Western impulse. But it seems like the ancient Greeks said, steam engine technology. And then they didn't develop it. Why? And some scholars say it's because the classical Greco-Roman man, again, to oversimplify, lived in a world where the gods ruled. And nature was not a safe place to investigate, and certainly wasn't something for us to tame in that way. We use technology to what? Dominate the earth, to harvest all these natural resources, to build these giant cities. And frankly, I just don't think that was an impulse for the Greeks and Romans in the same way. Because it's dangerous to meddle in the realm of God. You guys know the story of Icarus and Daedalus? What's the moral of that story? They make the wings and he flies too high and the sun burns the wings, falls down, and dies. Different versions of it. Is the moral of that story follow your passion, innovate, and make lots of money, and be a pioneer and an entrepreneur? No. Icarus and Daedalus, like so many classical stories, has the moral: know your place, mortal. Don't meddle in the affairs of the gods. Prometheus, Pandora's box. Don't mess with things. Well, the way one scholar put it is, don't take the wrapper off of nature. Just leave it alone. That is not at all the Western feeling about the world. The Western feeling about the world is expand, use reason, conquer the whole earth for different reasons. Why is this distinctively Catholic? Because as far as I can tell, Catholicism kind of grabbed onto this idea that, oh, there's this single God who is infinite, and Christ is the Logos, is reason itself. So the universe is a product of a rational mind. That means the whole universe is rational, it's understandable. And you might be thinking, yeah, obviously. But remember, the ancient Greeks and Romans didn't think that. They thought the universe was haunted by spirits, and it was under the purview of capricious gods. So scientific investigation is something really dangerous, right? This is something you want to mess with. So, the Christian comes along, has vanquished all the pagan deities, and then around the year 1000, 1100, there's this idea that, well, all of nature is rational, can be known. Let's investigate it, let's document it, let's categorize all of these things. That's where the university project comes from. The whole idea of the university is very distinctively Christian, but I think specifically Catholic idea. Unity, rational mind of God, and diversity, all of creation. University. So unity and diversity is the university project. They start these institutions with a specific goal in mind, which is to document all the knowledge in the universe and organize it. If you know anything about medievals, they were vigorous systematizers. They wanted to organize all knowledge. This is kind of a universalizing project, and it's one that's very much in accord with a specific way of thinking about reason. We're going to use reason as a tool, and we're going to understand comprehensively how the world works. That's a Catholic project. It becomes a Protestant project. It's still an Enlightenment project. That's what the scientific revolution is. That's why I say scientific revolution to me is so Catholic. And then the last stage of this is where this comes. Because a lot of scientific revolution guys, they still have a religious understanding. They still talk about belief in God. They still think tithing is important. But you get to the 20th century and you get what, for the first time in human history, the first atheist government, Soviet Union. So socialism kind of comes in as the last player in the story. Catholic, Protestant, Enlightenment, and socialism as this kind of, we're going to conquer the world with this global workers' revolution, and we're going to sort of solve the engineering problem that is life. And we're going to create an utopian society where we solve the problem of human society. And to me, that's still a very Western way of thinking about using reason to comprehensively master the world. And I see that as one of the kind of through lines through all of these movements. Now, all of that is Western, and I don't think that is the primary way that Orthodox Christians have or should approach their relationship with the world. And I'm going to talk about that in part 2. So far, so good? So I'm criminally overgeneralizing 1,000 years of history, but hopefully you're getting kind of the big picture. So I'm trying to answer the question, well, what is the West? And is it really Christian or not? And see, I'm teasing out. I think the answer is kind of not. So let's talk about two sorts of examples, because it's a little bit abstract. Two sorts of examples that I think are very Western and that are not very Orthodox. But I think there are things that we take for granted. And you'll forgive me, one of them is a little bit abstract. So the first one is this idea of the individual versus the person. When I say individual and person, you probably think these are synonyms. I'm an individual, I'm a person. What are you talking about? So there's a wonderful book, I don't know, maybe some of you know, it's called Being as Communions by Metropolitan Institute. He proposed in the last few years, I think, actually. He was the Metropolitan Perk one. And he basically argued, and I mean, people have issues with different things he said, but one of the things I liked in this text was he said that basically Christians invented, discovered, the concept of person for the first time in human history. And he reads the Capitulation Fathers, the two Gregories, and St. Mary's one. And he says basically, as they're kind of putting all this stuff together for the First Ecumenical Council, they, for the first time in human history, articulate the idea of what a person is. It didn't exist in human history before that. I think it's really interesting. What does he mean by that? Like, of course, persons. Well, what do we mean? Comes from the title of his book, Being as Communion. So his definition of a person is a being in communion with other persons. And you think, okay, that's pretty abstract. What are you talking about? So a simple example is, you have friends, you hang out with these friends, and you start to take on their mannerisms. You hang out with people, you take on their way of talking, their slang. You meet a family, and all the family has the same kind of frame of reference. It's like who you're around kind of shapes who you are. And that's something we all experience. But then at a more literal level, are you an individual body? Where did your body come from? Did it just spring out of the ground spontaneously? No. Your body is literally a part of your mother's body, or it was. Your body is something that your mother grew for you out of her body. And so when you look at a pregnant woman, you ask, well, is she one person or two? And it's kind of, the answer is both. Right? Because the baby's not independent of her, but there's clearly two humans in this picture. And so that blurring of what we call the one and the many philosophy, it's two persons, but it's one body. And that's how we describe marriage, right? One flesh, that's in the Bible, that's in Moses. And so, Zacharias' argument is that this idea of a being that is distinctly itself, but is also kind of inseparably in communion from other persons, not just emotionally, socially, but physically. That's what a person is. Something that's both one and many at the same time. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds to me a little bit like the Holy Trinity. Now, obviously, the way the Trinity is and the way humans are not identical. Nobody can walk in head for the Trinitarian heresies. But it's interesting to me that when we talk about the Trinity, we're talking about this thing that's both one and many. There's lots of explanations for that. I won't bore you with that too much. But something that Zacharias says is, what we mean by God in the biblical language, this is the language of the Bible, God is the Father. That is what we mean. Whenever they reference God in the Bible, the biblical language is here, referencing the Father, period, full stop. And you might think, okay, well, that sounds not Trinitarian to me. Here's the catch. What does Father mean? Father is an inherently relational word. So to be the Father means to have the Son, and in a less obvious way, to have the Holy Spirit. We won't get too much into that. Does that make any sense? Like, if God is the Father, that means God is not an individual. God is this set of relationships. So, persons are beings in communion. We are like this. The Trinity is this kind of par excellence. That's what a person is in the Orthodox understanding, as far as I can tell. What is an individual then? Well, that's the product. Getting to the punchline eventually. That's the product of this Western idea that the individual is not a being. The individual is a singular, atomized, you might say, individual. And if you read some of these, if you're familiar with some of the different writers of modernity, you know, John Locke or Rousseau, or they talk about the person not in terms of relations, but in terms of individuals. Every time I read Rousseau, I just spit my coffee out all the time. Because he talks about, he has these really weird passages. I don't know, have you read Rousseau at all? Now I'm missing. He has this passage where he's talking about everybody is a radical individual. We need to set up society so that way it benefits individuals and blah, blah, blah. And then he gets to the family. And he says, well, the family is just kind of this temporary, necessary institution. You have to make people, so I guess you have to do this family thing. But the second the children are independent of the parents, then they go back to being individuals. And having kids is kind of this weird, he didn't say necessary evil, that's what I was thinking. It's kind of this weird social contract where it's like, okay, well, for the betterment of the race, I'm going to restrict my freedom and become a father, and then the child will sort of be my slave for a while until I can train it to be its own individual. And then boom, now you're 18, leave the house. And so we tolerate that for a time, but then we have to go back to the state of nature, which is we're all radically separate individuals. And that's very obvious in all these kind of European and a lot of early American cultures. But I see it going all the way back through our program. I see it back in the Reformation. And when Luther says, "Here I stand, I can do no more." Which, by the way, Elsa and Frozen also says, "Here I stand," and that memory's been on my bucket too. As she gives her whole, the big Elsa dance number. "Here I stand." I'm like, it's this proclamation of radical individuals, and then she's making an ice cast. I don't know. I won't read these things, but it seems like that. So, what is that about? To me, that's about the assertion of. So, I will have violated the rule of my conscience. What does that mean? That means my individual identity is distinct from and separable from everything else. And Luther is not coincidentally the same person who says that all previous councils of the church are invalid. That's weird. I thought we were shaped by history and tradition and our families and culture. You're being as communion that's shaped by all these things. You receive a tradition, you receive certificates from your parents, you receive a whole way of life. We're Orthodox Christians. What do we receive? We receive holy tradition. It makes us who we are. The church is our mother. She forms us. But Luther says, no, something in here tells me that I'm not actually bound to those things. All the previous councils of the church are invalid. I'm not going to violate my conscience. That's about being an individual, a person. And if you go back to some of these Catholic writers, that's a whole other conversation. My Catholic friends are going to have a lot to say if I give too much detail about that. But I think it's not unfair to say that when we look back to the medieval world, we see them articulating persons kind of more like individuals. And that might be the start of this idea of thinking about the human being no longer in terms of persons beings in community, but in terms of individuals. And that may be one of the major seeds that's in the scholastic medieval period that grows up into the Reformation and then into the Enlightenment and then into socialism and whatever you want to call what we do here with this materialist world. I know, and then what do you get? I'm going to save my second too. I think maybe that's enough for now. But because I want to get to, before we go to Q&A in this first part, I want to look at how we understand the 21st century. This is a good connection, which is, so what can you guys think of any cultural situations, technology perhaps, where we are radically isolated and siloed off from each other? Everyone's sitting around the dinner table. And so how does this thing work? Well, the designers of these things, they have the algorithm, sort of this disembodied spirit. We'll come back to that part. What does it do? Well, it's programmed to notice what you watch for longer and what you watch for less time, or skip, whatever. And it curates a feed of things that it knows you want to look at. It's designed this way because this is what economists are calling the attention economy. Everybody wants your attention. That's how they make money, advertising, money, all that stuff. But that's really weird to me because what it does is it essentially builds for you a custom experience of the things you see when you open your phone. It creates a personalized echo chamber just for you, the radical individual consumer. And I see this, I have all kind of weird friends. I have friends all over the political spectrum. I have really conservative friends. And I have really liberal friends. And I used to ask them about saying, well, this news story came out. And what do you think of this? And the answer that the radical kind of conservative person gives, and the answer the kind of radical person gives, you have to kind of remind yourself that they're talking about the same thing. Because it just sounds like two different universes. You're like, are you guys even reading the same news stories? And in a certain sense, they are not. That's what this technology can do. It can completely isolate you into a different universe, actually a different worldview. And yet, these are people that I would get beer with all of these friends. And I'm very conservative. I want to get all of our friends. And I just sit there and listen and be like, we go to the same church, we have all the same social institutions, we're the same age, we were born in the same part of the same state. And yet you guys live in a different universe. I mean, you guys encounter this kind of thing. It's weird, the cognitive dissonance or the misalignment. What is that a product of? Well, it's a product of an entire billion-dollar technological culture, industry, that treats people as radically individual consumers. You've got to sell to them, obviously. But then it does this to you with the way you interact with technology. And to me, I'm saying this is the sort of late stage of the Western emphasis on the individual rather than the person. And if you follow anthropology as Euless, personhood is kind of this uniquely Orthodox Christian idea that's central to who and what we are. Because it doesn't exist before in the Greco-Roman world. The trivia would know. The word person comes from the Latin word persona, and probably comes from, that's a translation of the Greek word prosopon. They both mean literally mask. And so, and what that meant in the Greco-Roman context was your face before the state. So if you had a face before the state, then you had existence. Slaves were called aposopon, I think, which was non-persons. They don't exist in the face of the state because they don't have legal status. So literally they're not persons. That's why the Greco-Roman world is radically dismissive of human life. They would, I'm sure you guys know, they crucified people like crazy, they threw people to the Colosseums, they had slaves, they discarded them. The idea that every person had unique individual human rights, you probably couldn't have explained this to a Roman. You say, well, everybody is equal and has equal human dignity. They probably just crucified them. It was not possible for them to think of the world in terms like this, because baked into their language was literally the idea that some people were persons and others were not. Because the word person for them, persona, did not mean what it means for us. So what's the gap? And why did the world have this idea of persona and now we have a totally different one? Well, obviously, God became man. That's the reason that we believe in radical human dignity. But God that we worship is not, and that we are, when we take communion, that we become joined to Him, is a personal God, meaning He is a being in communion, and then He invites you to be a being in communion with Him. That's why your identity, your most important identity, is your Christian identity. And when St. Paul says, as many who have been baptized in Christ have put on Christ, it's not fancy language, it's not a metaphor. The Eucharist is God. Literally. Physically. So you eat, you are what you eat, you guys know that. So you eat Him, You are Christ, literally, physically, but you don't merge with him. You're not absorbed in him. You're still distinctly you. But that's what being a person means in the Orthodox Christian mind. You're distinctly you and fundamentally united to other persons at the same time, both yourself and the church. Yeah. Is this going on in the West? No. Obviously, look around now, it's not how we think of persons. There's a trend on social media now of, I don't know, like, who's aware of that, but there's this trend on social media, I think especially on Instagram, of radically just cutting off your parents. Like, there's all these videos that encourage well, your parents are bad for your health, never speak to them again. And I know some sad things that have happened. But it's this thing that's being encouraged weirdly by all these content creators. And when I think about this, I'm the child of Italian immigrants, and I just think like, you can't cut off your parents. You just are your parents. I'm turning to my grandfather all every day more and more. So it's like you're just part of it. You have no identity outside of it. And that's the basic way we exist. So just draw to the end of this first part, how do we understand living in the 21st century? And I think one way, there are many, I just picked a person thing, but there are many ways to talk about here's something that's going on in the West and how basically in Orthodoxy we do something completely different. When you look at technology, it's kind of a threat to your personhood because it wants to make you not a person, or it wants to make you to a division, to consume. And something radically isolated from other people. And if you talk to any Generation Z, they'll tell you how awful and miserable it is dating, how no one can get married or even hook up. It's just it's a complete dating wasteland in a way, whatever you tell them. And so increasing technology, increasing individualization, increasing atomization, more loneliness, more mental health problems, more technology. Why? Because the technology reinforces the non-orthodox view of what the human being is. And I think it's distinctly Western. And that's one way in which orthodoxy is not Western. So I guess I'll stop there for the Q&A. And then we're going to take a little break, I think, for part two. Something like that. That's just good. This is
Earlier you mentioned the invention came from history started in the West. That's true. After the Roman and the Greek were not interested. But if you look at that history, a lot of inventions came from Roman time and Greek time. So how do you look at it?
Yeah, so this is the danger of overgeneralizing very quickly. Very good question. So, well, how do you hear the question? You say, obviously the Greeks and Romans invented many things. How do you say that? Every culture invents. Every culture has its geniuses. Every culture has its inventors. Every culture has its technology. That's true. Of course. I did my bachelor's degree in classics. I learned Greek and Latin. I love Plato and Aristotle and all those guys. Love them. And they made all sorts of things. They were brilliant. They were brilliant. But the question is, what do you use technology for? And my read is that the Greco-Roman world, yes, they expanded, yes, they made things, yes, they had a beautiful culture, but they weren't obsessed with world domination in the way that the West was. All of our inventions are about massive expansion, conquering, circumnavigating the world, conquer the whole universe. You know, the example I gave last week when I talked was, Americans are so, we must conquer all space. This idea of manifest destiny. We get here, we can't just be happy in these goals. We have to continually expand. It's our destiny to conquer the whole continent. And then we circumnavigate the globe, and then we conquer the whole planet. And then what do we have to do? We've got to go to the moon. For no reason. Nothing happened. It was just a money sink, forgive me. I mean, it was a grand achievement, He's like, go to the moon. We put an American flag on it. And my Greco-Roman sympathy is that sticking a flag in the face of the moon seems impious to me. I don't think Aristotle would have thought that was a good thing. He would have said, the moon is a goddess, and I'm not going to stick a toothpick in her face. That's impious. So it's not that the Greeks and Romans are not brilliant and they don't make their own technologies. It's like, what kind of technologies do they make? Would it even occur to them to go to the moon? I think probably not. Not because they're inferior to Western, but maybe because they're morally superior. They don't think that it's their right to conquer all space and time. They want to live in harmony with God, which is a pious system. Yes.
I could give a contrary example. Where social media is fairly new. Before, television was something that everyone watched and it was pretty on, we all watched the same program. So you could look at the internet as a great way of people to come together. That there are certain entities that are taking advantage of that algorithms, whether they are individuals or corporations. I don't know that that's the same thing as the question of technology.
What is the question of technology?
Well, how is technology making us more individualistic? Because you can also see the internet as being something that would bring everyone together, which even this community here is brought together by technology. Right? We didn't have that. We'd have to say, do something else that would be less convenient. So technology, even with lights, it seems like to me it seems like it's neutral, and that there's something else involved that may be this fundamental push towards individualism.
So somebody always brings this up. So we don't want to get dragged into the is technology or good or bad argument that you can point out. It's not really the answer to that in terms of neutral. But let's very briefly think about our relationship to technology as a species. And by that I want to say our technology to knowledge as a species. All of our stories in Christianity and in paganism are kind of grouped around the same theme. The serpent says to Eve, take the tree of knowledge, you shall be as gods. Knowledge of gods. In the book of Enoch, which is referenced by the church fathers in a fairly authoritative way, the fallen gods mingle with human women, they give birth to the Nephilim, that starts the flood, but they also give them all this technology, metalworking, alchemy, wood cutting. Prometheus, one of the gods, comes down and brings fire, technology to man, and it's a bad thing, he's punished. So there's all of these, in Tower of Babel, we're going to use technology to ascend to heaven, and that's shut down by God. So I'm always struck by, I think it's Irenaeus, who says that when God made man, he intended to give him the tree of knowledge. But man was immature, he was just made. So God imposed a fast on Adam until such a time as he was mature enough to take the tree of knowledge. So you can fit technology in there. The problem is not knowledge. The problem is not technology, because God wants to be co-creators until that, cultivate the garden, be part of this work, be the priest of creation. The problem is, seeing take all these stories together, our issue is not that we have knowledge or technology, is that we're not mature enough to use it in a good way. And so the thought experiment I often do is, well, let's take all these medieval Catholic monks who were really the kind of inventors and pioneers of their time. They're the ones who came up with all this manuscript technology and water wheel monasteries were doing all this stuff in mills and mechanical clock. The monks were at the driving tip of the spear for technological innovation. What if, for whatever reason, that was still our world, and it was those guys and not the Silicon Valley guys making all this tech? Would they invent social media? Would they invent pornography, digital pornography? Would they invent the infinite scroll? It's like what are we doing with this technology? Well, we're, as a civilization, making these things that are pretty intentionally designed to destroy and enslave the human person properly. That's a problem of spiritual orientation, not a problem of technology. So the warning is, like, oh, technology we're bad. It's like, well, we're certainly making the worst possible things. That's right? That do enslave us. Obviously, it doesn't have to be that way. But the solution is to have saints and monks making it. But of course, this is not the world we live in. I mean, Silicon Valley people are not very good. Is that all? Yes, sir.
It's not my idea, but I have from one Russian religious philosopher. Basically, the modern technological guru like Peter Thiel, they in essence want to become God through technology. So they want to, while Orthodox Christians want to become not gods, but in communion with God. So it's a soul. So in the movement, even in the growth, can you comment?
Yeah, that's a great parallel. So if you didn't hear, he said, we want to become gods in a certain sense. We want to become like Christ let's say that they say God became man so that man could become God. He doesn't mean what Peter Thiel means. Peter Thiel, all these technological gurus, they want to become immortal. I mean, if you read some of the things that they say, Sam Altman, some of these people, they think that AI is them building God for the first time. There's all these bizarre religious claims that they're making because fallen man, something I argued on my podcast, it seems that there's redeemed man who repents and takes communion and becomes holy and communion with God. Well, if you don't do that, what are you going to do? I think the only other thing you do is something, because Christ is the logos. I call it the dark logos. And that's bad. You use technology to make yourself artificially into God. And that's the evil kind of counterpoint to use of technology. If we were holy, that and the fall of technology would be for cultivating garden and that sort of thing. So the dark logos is we're going to artificially become God on our own terms. So you guys know Father Stephen DeYoung, he argues that, he's an Old Testament scholar, and he argues that when we talk about the Tower of Babel, it's not really the city thing that you see in a lot of the Renaissance art. It's a pyramid. It's a ziggurat. And what is a pyramid? He says a pyramid is an artificial mountain. Because you notice that the gods are up on mountains. Moses goes up to Sinai to get the law to meet God on top of a mountain. The Olympians live on Olympus, a real mountain in Greece. So it's kind of understood that the gods are up in the sky. We're going to get to them by a mountain. That's natural. But if you want to make it yourself, you make a pyramid, an artificial mountain, to ascend up to the heights and become your own gods on your own terms. And so to Father DeYoung, this is the reason that Babel is impious, that it's sort of the symbol of dark logos, fallen man, using technology to become God, in lieu of repenting and taking you first to become holy.
So basically, it's the technology in the Western way is a kind of new Babylon Tower.
I think very literally. Because what else? I mean, you could use technology to become immortal. Do this and that, and you become immortal. And you should all think like, it's over. It's in there. The medicine of immortality is in there. But how do you get it? You have to repent. You have to go to confession. You have to purify yourself with passions. That's a lot of work. And I would rather keep my passions on the PhD or the same altar or whatever. I don't want to repent and change. I want to be immortal on my own terms. Scary. Yes, ma'am.
If you're making the argument, that I think I understood correctly, that
I think I'm asking this one word. By Christians, you mean different denominations?
Yeah, like all the different denominations of Christians, because I feel like it's so split
Yeah.
right now. How do you see a way forward?
I mean, so let me preface this by saying that my Italian family are a bunch of lapsed Catholics. My parents became born-again Christians. We were raised in the Presbyterian church. I converted to Orthodoxy in college. I had a lot of Protestant friends. I went to my PhD Catholic University. So, like, I've been totally inundated by all these different languages. I have very dear people in my life who I love. My dad is Catholic. It's like, all that to say, so I resisted this conclusion for like a decade and a half. But I think the only conclusion that you can really draw is that these are different religions. They're just different religions. I don't know how else to put that. Because the doctrine is different, and then the Catholic Orthodox thing, you know, and even with Protestants especially, you know, part of the problem with ecumenical discussions is that everybody has to redefine the terms all the time. Well, by grace, I mean this. By apostolic, I really mean this. And when you have to redefine all of the terms to have a conversation, you're not speaking the same language. It's really not the same religion. And the creed is different. The creed is the definition of what a Christian is. If you change one word of the creed, it's not the creed anymore. And so I don't know what else to say than that from an institutional perspective. But my Protestant friend, when I kind of was forced to admit what I thought about this to them, they made a jump that I'm not making. Just, oh, so you think we're not going to heaven? That's not what I'm saying. I don't know who's going to heaven. There's one person who knows, one person who is the judge of all. And that's not a question we should ask as Orthodox Christians. That is in different Protestant circles growing up, and they're very obsessed with, like, well, those people are not going to make it, you know. And we, you know, I was at a reform school, it's a Calvinist believe in predestination, you know, and there's a lot of conversation like that, and when I became Orthodox, I was just freed from all this. I don't have to make these evaluations. God loves every person more than I love anything at all. And He wants all to be saved, this is what we know from the Scriptures. And He loves everyone, and He's trying to bring everyone in. And so, you know, and it's like Abraham's not a Christian either, in a certain sense. He doesn't have to be. It's just like we have to believe and hope in God's love and not make judgments about salvation. I refuse to talk about being saved. But I know what the church is. The church is just historically factual what the church is. I think that it's really hard to make any other case. But one way of putting it is that a lot of people think that being a Christian, being part of the church, and being saved are all the same thing. And it's not. We know what the church is. The Christian thing is hard to define. You could just say, well, these are all Christian denominations, sure. But who's saved? Cannot say. Does that help?
Would you say because they're different religions, they also worship a different God? Or just
The reference problem is my philosophy, for instance. You guys hear that if they're different religions, they worship the same God. And philosophy is called the problem of reference. I'm going to completely disparage that whole conversation. It's not even, I don't even think it gets us anywhere. The thing is, all Christ is the Logos, by whom all things were made. So at some level, Christ is the truth in all things. So I don't, trying to frame the religious question in terms of, are you worshiping the same God? Is something like, do I have the right kind of propositions about religion? And that's what's going to make me the correct kind of Christian, and that's how I'm going to get saved. So we're going to take a more orthodox approach to it. God loves everyone, and He wants everyone to be saved. And not everybody becomes an Orthodox Christian all throughout history. And the early church fathers wrestled with this problem. What about the virtuous pagans? What about Abraham? What about all these people? The answer was they can be saved too. So God in His mercy and His love saves people. Forget me, we're outside the technical historical church. And so how do you answer your question? Well, you don't have to know exactly all the right things about God to be saved. There are illiterate saints who never read the Bible because they were illiterate, but they were holy and they were wonderful. So there's things like that where it's not propositional, that's like a Western way of thinking about it. It's God's mercy. It's not a test. It's always just not a test. That said, so when I say it to people like, oh, well, I guess you can believe whatever you want. God loves you, but that's like, right? There's one chalice, there's one faith, there's one medicine, one chalice. What's that? So, like, in other words, it's not, I don't know. Like, if somebody imperfectly worships God, as he's from another tradition, is that worse than me imperfectly worshiping God because my passions belong me to understanding something about Him? Like, at one level, no. At another level, obviously, you want the right doctrine. You know, is that people are never satisfied with this? But I'm trying not to say two things. I'm trying not to say it doesn't matter what religion you're part of. It matters. You should be an Orthodox Christian. And I'm also not saying everyone who's not an Orthodox Christian straight confirmed. Yes, sir.
So, I mean, I agree that Christianity says all people are persons. But that's also, I think, I'm not an Old Testament expert by any stretch, but that's present in the Old Testament and in the fact that we're made in the image of God. Because your explanation was more Christ became man, so that makes us persons, but we were persons before that.
Yes, true.
Okay.
What I was saying is that if the first time in history that this is really articulated is with the academics.
Right, okay, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, they don't invent the concept, it's not a construct. They discover it, if you want to put it
It was
out.
emphasized more, like with the Samaritan, but there were stories in the Old Testament, like the prophet who marries the prostitute.
Or Adam and Eve, to give the best example. So when Adam meets Eve, what does he say to her? He identifies her as him. Oh, you are bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And then Moses' commentary is, and that's why a man who leaves his father and mother unites his wife and become one flesh. So that concept of the person is there. Just like the concept of the Trinity is kind of there throughout the text, but it's not explicitly articulated until when I see it. Really. So if that makes you feel better, like it's an articulation or a discovery, yeah.
Another thing with the individualism is we're all, this is also, I think, when they talk about the beginning church, we all have different towns and we can bring them together. So in that way, we're all individuals. It's just that I wonder if the point is a little, can be made differently, that the idea that reason is far above the exalted value rather than compassion makes us like hurtful individuals. Like we go too far. The heart isn't in it, so to speak. We're not connected when we make these so-called cold decisions. So anyway, I was just, because we all come here as individuals with different things to offer, and different problems, and the sacraments really support that. So anyway.
Yeah, so, right. So when I say we're not individuals, I'm not saying you're not distinct. You're clearly distinct. You all have different talents, you all look different, you're all clearly distinct people. But the way I'm using individual is in this specifically kind of modernist sense where you're not really defined by your relationships to others. So when the ultimate model for this is the conciliar language about the Trinity, where Christ is clearly distinct from the Father and the Spirit. We don't think that they're all just different faces of the same God. But they share one essence, and they're both distinct, but also inseparably united. And that's kind of the whole mystery that the Christian world is able to articulate once people like St. Basil are articulating it in a way that pre-Christian people just didn't have the language to really think about that.
Let's take a break now, so we'll have some time to have a Q&A in the next session as well. So, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes.
Hi. So, in part 2, I was asked, part 1, what's going on with secularism? Part 2, what's going on with the sacraments and the sacrament of life? Now, I'm going to retread a lot of the text, I think, but it's important. I think it's important to repeat this and emphasize this because this is the way out. You know, people are always asking, I think this extremely grim, pessimistic picture of civilization. What do we do? And so this is the connection to that. And I want to make that connection very clear to you because, well, I'll tell this story. So I mentioned this in the debate. Yeah, so I recently did a debate. It's not live yet. It'll be live in maybe 1 or 2 months. You'll hear all about that. But I did a debate with a man who works at OpenAI, who makes ChatGPT. And the debate was techno-optimism and techno-pessimism. You guess which side I am. And the moderator was very aggressive in this debate. She kept trying to pin us down to things. And when she was poking at me, she kept saying, okay, well, what is your prescription? How do we stop it? You know, because I was basically arguing, you want, and that's about this debate. I was basically arguing that for our lifestyle, this technology is something close to summoning demons and asking them to prophesy for you, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And she said, well, if it's demons, then just shut it down. You know, what is your prescription for all of this? You know, how do you solve the problem? And she's got one thing. And I said, there is no societal solution to this, as far as I can tell. It's just going to happen. It's just going to get worse. And all of the resistance to it at a cultural level is really bad. The Orthodox are not triumphalistic in this way. We don't think that we have to solve and master the culture for our religion to be valid, because we're the persecuted church under the Ottomans, under the Soviets. I mean, we don't need to conquer the earth to live our religion. We can be killed by the Romans and be saved. So therefore, the solution is personal. It's repentance. It's a catchphrase it's become a catchphrase on my podcast. I say, turn off the news, go to Vespers. And the readers are like, you should put that on coffee. But really, I think that's the societal solution, because part of the Western idea is utopian. We're going to use reason or the right interpretation of the Bible or the right system of understanding the world or the right laws, the right economics, the right president. Once we get everything right, then we'll have a good society. And for the church, who's just sort of been murdered for over and over for 2,000 years ago, maybe, it's not on the top of the priority list. The top of the priority list is repentance and entering the kingdom of heaven. And when I brought this up on the podcast, some people said, well, isn't that sort of a cop-out answer? You're not really answering the question. We want you to take a side in politics. And I said, this was in the context of talking different types of government. And I said, listen, the best form of government is the kingdom of heaven. And I don't mean that in a symbolic way. I mean that in a very deeply literal way. It doesn't matter what the arrangement of laws is if everyone in the society is the same. It doesn't really matter. Everyone's repentant, everyone's humble, everyone is loving, and everyone is physically and literally Christ in one body. So, the answer to all of these problems, to all this crazy dark age nonsense, I call these ages the dark ages. The medieval world is not the dark ages. This is the dark ages, perhaps. The solution is repentance. The solution is becoming fully human. If you read my book, you know the title, right? I wrote this title like 6 months, being an academic ruined me for title. It's like blah, 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 colon, blah, 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 the titles, 75 words. Titling that thing is terrible. Think about what is the title. And Journey to Reality kind of clicked for me, because that's what we're doing. We're becoming fully human, because we're not fully human yet. We're becoming real, because we're not fully real yet. We're still growing. We're still Adam and Eve in the garden. So, therefore, I'm going to now talk about some of the fundamentals of how to understand orthodoxy as a political solution, as a cultural solution. You want to save the world? Save this. Because all of this is passing away. And that doesn't mean live in the world. It doesn't mean don't live in the world, because Christ is incarnate. He's fully human. He's here with us. But hopefully by the end of this, you have a little more awe about what actually is going to happen tomorrow. So, I think I'll go for this, because she said most people read the text. I see the show of hands. Who read it? Okay, so a little over that. So I'll go through this maybe a little bit quickly, and then I'll take a little more time for Q&A. Father, when do you want to be, how much buffer do you want to have between this and 5 o'clock for the rest?
If we start a little late, it's okay.
Okay.
Just go ahead.
Right. Okay, so what are these core ideas that I think are essential to understanding the Orthodox life? Because, if you don't know, this book came out of me teaching Introduction to Theology to college freshmen. And what I found is that you can say the one. You can say God is one essence and 3 persons. The Eucharist is Christ. Christ is human nature and divine nature. If they weren't born in this, and sometimes if they are, they're just scary. They're like, what does that mean? And why do I care? And that's an incredibly important question. Why do you care? So I wrote this text to pin down sort of the core ideas that they just were missing about how to think about the world. So the first is God. When we're talking about God in American culture, the problem is a lot of times you get this idea that God is something like omnipotent Santa Claus. He spies on everyone all the time. He sits up here. He writes his naughty and nice list. Oh, you sin. Puts you on the list, And then at the end, when Christ returns, you get your presents or your coal. I mean, am I oversimplifying? That's the feeling that we sort of get when you talk to a lot of people about God. That he has come from some kind of omnipotent spy who's mainly here to punish people or reward people, but only you, of course, because you're the one who does it all right. The word I use in the text for God is, let's not use this language for now. Because the word God, it's been so, what does that even mean? You talk to somebody comes up to you on the street corner from Southern California. So somebody comes up to you on the street corner and says, you want to hear about God? And you would have no idea what's going to come out of this person's mouth. That's complete anything. Because these words have kind of lost their meaning in being overused so much. So I said, look, let's use the word God with a lowercase g to talk about things like Zeus or Thor. Those are, you guys know your mythology, that all the ancient cultures, they believed in what? All this plurality of gods. And the gods all have their own personalities, they have their own vices a lot of the time, and they fight with each other, they do all these different things. But it's pretty clear that even though they're superhumanly powerful, that they are not all. They're not all powerful. There's something above them, even in the Greco-Roman world. Often things like that state or the God. There was such a thing as Greek monotheism before Christianity. I don't know if you know that. And they believed there was something above the sort of bickering family of the gods that was higher than them, that maybe made them, or that they came from. People didn't know. And then God came in and learned about it. So we're going to use the word little g God to mean all those petty deities, those things. In this book I said, let's use a different word to talk about what Christianity is trying to talk about. And the word I offered was arche, or arche. It's a Greek word, it means origin, it kind of means principle. In modern Greek it means beginning. And I said, let's use this word, because what this word means, I want to get rid of the connotations. What this word means is something like reality itself. The thing that we worship and became incarnate as Christ is something closer to a reality itself. Now, I don't mean it's impersonal. I don't mean not talking about God the Father. But you have to think about this in these terms. Zeus and Thor, these guys, they have limitations. They're clearly not all powerful. They're clearly quite bad people following theology. But the arche is something like meaning itself. It's also something like morality itself, goodness itself. The analogy I use is, if you walk into a park in springtime and look around, you see all the birds and all the trees and all the flowers, and wow, this park is teeming with life. And I'm a human being, smart aleck, and I say, oh, what do you mean, life? Where is it? Point to it. And you say, well, the tree has life, the squirrels have life, the birds have life. And I say, no. You said life, where is it? Those things have life, but where is the thing that is life itself that you're referring to? And the answer is you can't point to it. You point to things that have life, but you can't point to the thing that is life itself. In other words, the power by which all those things are alive. And it's the same with existence itself. There are many things that exist, you can see them all around. But no one of those things is existence itself, the power by which things exist at all. And the Christian answer is that's what we mean by God. The thing that is the source of all reality, the source of all life, the source of all goodness. That is what we're talking about. And clearly that's above and distinct from any of these petty deities. Thor isn't reality itself. He's some God. Zeus isn't reality itself. He gives into his passions all the time. And so it's important to center all of this on this idea that what we're talking about, when the Christian is talking about God, he's talking about life itself, existence itself, being itself, and goodness itself. God is goodness. He is nature. He is the source of all things. That's why the question, well, who created God? Get these smart allegations. God, blah, 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 where did he come from? And the correct answer is he did. He is beginningless. He is the uncaused cause. That's how Aristotle would put it. He has no source. To ask where being itself came from doesn't even make sense. It's like asking what color is Thursday. It's a day. It doesn't have a color. The arche is the arche. It doesn't have a beginning. It's the same kind of invalid question. So to me, this is the center of the whole thing, because that makes sense out of everything that's going to follow, and why the Eucharist at the end of this, why the Eucharist is so important. So with the Trinity, very briefly, the idea with the Trinity is that this is the hardest thing to teach to freshmen at 7 in the morning for a required class. By the way, it's a very hard sell. And so, because the Trinity is very technical, so complicated, everybody's sitting there, they don't want to be here. And I just started by saying, look, I'm not going to, I said, well, you all are going to have all these issues with what I said. I don't think you actually want to understand how the Trinity works. I don't really think that's most people's question. There's always one person who wants to get into technical, but most people don't really care about the technical explanation. What most people want to know, in my experience, is who cares? Why does this matter? That we have to make these very, very careful distinctions about the oneness and the Trinity. And the answer I give in the text is this. What we have going on in the Trinity, if there was no Trinity, there'd be no such thing as love. So how do we understand this? If I say the sentence, I love you, there's certain essential elements in it. There's the I, there's the you, and there's the verb, love. And for that sentence to have the meaning that we want it to have, there's two things that have to be going on. First of all, there has to be a difference between I and you. We have to be distinct, like you were pointing out. So, because if we're all the same, ultimately the same being, which is what you see in Hinduism and some of these other religions, then I love you just means I love me. Right? There has to be distinction for there to be really love between two people. So you have to have distinctiveness. You have to have what's called the many. It's one and many thing. So you have to have many, multiplicity, I and you. Okay? But you also have to have the verb in the middle make sense. Love. So, if by love we just mean, well, I have this particular emotional reaction to you, that's not really enough for the sentence to make sense, right? Because I have particular emotional reactions to potato chips, but that's not the same feeling I have toward my wife. Obviously, something is different there. And the idea is that for there to be love, there has to be something that's fundamentally shared between me and my wife, like two friends, or whatever. Something in which we can be one. You have to have the many part, the I and the you. You have to have the oneness part, something where we can actually be connected. Because otherwise, what all love means is, I say I love you, my wife says I love you. Do I mean, I have this very specific emotional reaction about you. And she says, well, I have a same emotional reaction toward you. And it's nice that they line up. I love my wife loves me. But you watch any rom-com, and it's like you don't have to line up. She loves him, he doesn't love her. And what that means is there are two different emotional reactions. It's not really the same thing. You tell your friend or your child or your parent or your spouse, I love you. You don't mean, isn't it great that our emotional reactions to each other are line up? It's not what we mean. It's very impoverished idea of people who love us. The Christian idea, this idea of the person we talked about in the last section, is there has to be both the I and the you, but the love, the verb in the middle, has to have some common shared element that's real. That's something we share. In the Trinity, that's the essence of God. The Trinity has one essence. So we can say there is one God. There are not three gods. That's the oneness part. But also, they're not the same. Because if they were just the same, then the love between the Father and the Son would just be the Father loving himself. If the Son is the Father. The Son is distinct from the Father. He prays to the Father. He says, not my will, but your will. And they are distinct. There's an I and you in the Trinity. There's greater. But there's one essence, so we can call it one God. And so the Trinity kind of provides, simplifying it, but the Trinity kind of provides this model for how we can understand love the way we want to understand it. There's distinction, but there's something that's fundamentally shared. God has the essence of God. Now, people are like this too, although God being the archaic, there's nothing really that is fully analogous to the Trinity. Nothing is exactly like the Trinity. The Trinity is weird. But you get a sense of it with the way that we exist, with the one flesh of marriage produces children who literally have the flesh of their mother, they're made out of their mother's body. Even the tiny part of the father's wife is still counted. So you're made of, gotta make sure you guys are aware, you're made of your parents physically. So actually you share a substance, you share a nature with your parents, but you're also distinct from them. But you're not radical individuals that just popped up out of the ground on your own. So you're one and you're many. And so the Trinity, well, not identical to the Trinity, is kind of this cosmic model for how this manifests in you and I. That's how we're one and many. That's what our sense of the person starts with the Trinity, and then God says, let's make man in our image. And that means many things. People take it differently. But I think one of the things it means is that let's make man as persons, as we are persons. And we share this image of God in this way. And so the point of the Trinity, why this is so important and why so much ink was spilled over it, is because if God is in Trinity, you lose one of these things. If he's just one, then if he's just one, then there's no I in you. There's just I love me. G.K. Chesterton criticizing this idea. He said the universe would just be like one selfish being hugging itself if everyone was one. That's not I love you. That's like, and hugging yourself is just kind of a weird image. It's absurd. But if you lose the distinctiveness, then it just kind of blurs into one selfish being. But if you lose the unity, for us, the physical unity, then we're all just radical individuals, and we can't really have communion. And then all I mean is by I love you is, well, I enjoy you, I consume you in some way. You know, that's not what we mean. So, marching through this. There's something else that's really important to therefore understand about the type of theology that we do in our church, which we call sacramental theology. This is really hard one for the students. Because in Western culture, we're trained to think of the spiritual and the physical as two different things. You know? When I ask people, well, what do you think a miracle is? A lot of people will sign off on something like, well, the universe is run by all these physical laws of nature, the laws of physics. And a miracle happens when God kind of just pauses the laws of physics, does something, and then unpauses and everything goes back to normal. In other words, the physical and the spiritual are separable. There is the physical world, yes, science explains that, but then there's the spiritual world, and that's kind of something else. It's higher, it's sort of an optional belief. You can have your own view about it if you want. You know, the physical world, that's what we all agree on. We all live there. We're not going to have an argument about it. It's very enlightenment thinking. This comes out of the Western world. The sacramental answer, and what I would say is the definition of what sacramentalism means, is that it's the idea that the physical and the spiritual are not fundamentally separate. Everything physical has some spiritual content to it. Everything spiritual has some physical manifestation. The exception, of course, being the arche, because the arche is being itself and exists prior to the world. But now, with the incarnation, God too has a physical instantiation. He bridges the gap between God and man. So, is this too abstract? Because it's like the idea is, you know, these physical things mean things. And what I mean by that is, something I say to people is, in the Orthodox Church, we don't do symbolism. In the sense that this thing stands for this other thing. The priest dresses this way because it kind of reminds us of this other thing. We decorate the church in a certain way to remind us of this or that. This is set up, we don't know, we're going to get to this in a second, like the Jewish temple, and that there's these three levels to it, and then there's the Holy of Holies with the altar, all that stuff. And it's all done in this purposeful, let's say, participation in the liturgy of Moses. So you guys know, what was in the Ark of the Covenant, the lighted staff of Aaron, 2 tablets of the law, the jar of manna. We put all of those things in our altar too. The lighted staff of Aaron is the cross, the jar of manna is the bread of the Eucharist, the tablets of the law are the Gospels. Do we do it that way for fancy symbolism because it reminds us of the Old Testament? No. Our idea is that by imitating those things, we actually participate in them. It's physical and spiritual together. It's not a reminder. That's what I church Protestants do. We're actually trying to imitate in order to participate. So, one way to put this is that for all ancient people, it would have been very obvious to them that imitation is the same as participation. When you imitate something, you kind of participate in the spirit of that thing. I'll give you a quick example. When I was a kid, my dad, I was like 6 or something, loved Batman, obviously. So my dad rented this Batman costume for Halloween, and it was like very, very accurate. I don't know who it actually was, but my dad walked into the room with Batman. And as a 6-year-old, I felt this little feeling in my chest. Because I was like, is that? Like, where did Dad go? It was a little bit confusing. But, my dad was neither because he was like getting into everything. But what is that? Why did I feel something in my chest? Because by role playing, by putting on a mask, by participating, he's kind of participating in the cultural energy of that. And when you look at so many cultures, they use masks and role play as part of their religious and cultural festivals. I'm thinking, just off the top of my head, of many Japanese folk kind of cultural traditions involve putting on the masks of different spirits of the artificial Japanese folklore, and sort of there's role play elements to that. And the idea is we're not just doing this for fun, we're not doing this as a reminder. That's what a modern culture is. All ancient people would have thought, well, by imitating, you actually participate in these things really. Now, the only way that makes sense is that the physical and spiritual are not really separate. They're interrelated all the time. So every physical thing you do has spiritual content to it. There's nothing that's just physical. That is a modern idea. Orthodox don't think that, and the sacraments wouldn't work or make any sense if that were true. And we also don't think that, most things are just physical, but certain things in the church are spiritual. No, we say everything has spiritual content. How you dress, how you move, what you say, everything comes out of your mouth. The whole thing is spiritual content because the whole universe is physical and spiritual at the same time. And so the sacraments, they are this kind of, I'm going to say something like exaggerated, but let me give you this example instead. When Moses goes up the mountain, Mount Sinai, the way Father Dion and many others read this, is that God doesn't just tell him the route. He shows him something. He shows him the divine cosmic energy that's being done all of the time by the angels around the throne of God. And he gives him these very specific prescriptions. When you go back down and make the temple, it has to be exactly these dimensions, it has to be exactly all these things, put the gold here, put this in, it's extremely detailed. If you ever tried to slog through this part of the Old Testament, you're like, why do I care about all this? And it's very, very important to them. It's central because they're ancient people. God showed them one of these supreme secrets. How does reality really work up there? The angels are doing the cosmic liturgy around the throne of God. That's why the archangels are often depicted dressed as deacons, because they are sort of this angelic cosmic deacons in the liturgy that is all of reality. That's another part of saying that the physical and spiritual aren't separate. It's that the whole universe is kind of everything. Now, there's disharmony in the liturgy because of the fall of men and the fall of angels, but it's still within this giant cosmic liturgical motion. I think a long time ago, George Peterson said, "Isn't the world more like a giant symphony or musical masterpiece than it is like anything else?" And I was like, "That's strange." You guys read your Narnia or your Tolkien. How does Aslan create Narnia? He sings it into being. You read the Silmarillion if you like Tolkien. How does Tolkien say the world is created? God made the angels made a choir, and they sung the world into being. So there's kind of this musical order to reality, at the heart of reality. What do we do in church? Choir, singing, that's the work of the liturgy. We sing it into being. That's why, unlike in the West, you can't actually conduct the divine liturgy with just a priest by himself. The Catholic priest can just say the Mass by himself, but we need one other person to do the back and forth with the priest. So, the universe has got this divine, cosmic, symphonic, musical reality to it. And so, if we imitate with some level of precision, we actually participate in it. So, that's why the Jews in the Old Testament are so particular about how the tabernacle has to be arranged. Because if they do it right, they will literally participate in these spiritual realities. So the Ark of the Covenant kills people. They interact with it in the wrong way. Not because God is looking down and goes, "Oh, he touched the Ark of the Covenant." That's not what's going on. It's because it's like spiritually radioactive, if you want to put it that way. Every physical thing has spiritual content. That's why the Nazis are getting blown up in the prayers all started. It's an old movie now, I guess. So Moses is imitating the liturgy of the cosmos. And we understand ourselves as continuing the liturgy of Moses. We're not imitating. Well, we are imitating, but now it's fulfilled. Moses imitated the cosmic liturgy, he participates in it, and then the early Christians would have just said, we don't need the second temple. As you guys know, in AD 70, the temple was destroyed by the Romans, the Jewish temple, never rebuilt. And the Christians said, we don't need it to be rebuilt, because our form of worship here, and we feel so weird when I say I'm talking in church like that, just being here on. This is a continuation of the liturgy of Moses. That's the liturgy we do. And that's why I say to people, I think we're the only ones doing the liturgy of Moses. Have the iconostasis, all these things. So when you go to church, what's happening? You're participating in the cosmic liturgy. That's why it's so important for us Orthodox Christians that we don't change the aesthetics. It's not just decoration. It needs to be configured in a way so that it sufficiently imitates the cosmic liturgy. Otherwise, you can't participate in it. So when you walk into church, into the temple, you are participating in heaven. So this is another difference between East and West. Father John Strickland is the one who pointed this out to me, that in Catholicism we kind of have this idea that God is real, but he's like in heaven. He's somewhere else. He's looking down. He interacts, obviously, but then there's this thing called purgatory. It kind of puts this infinite, definite distance between us and the people of heaven. And a Catholic can sign off on what I'm allowed to say, but I think the aesthetics are different, and that's important, which is that we say, it's incarnation. God is here. This is heaven. You guys go to heaven all the time. Whenever you go to liturgy, you're literally going to heaven, physically. Now, obviously, it doesn't seem like that. There's two reasons for that. One is, the Father saying, it's a foretaste. It's in part. It's not the fullness of the kingdom of heaven. It's a little bit of the kingdom of heaven. It's about as big as it fits on your tongue, right? And so, it's a foretaste of something that's come. The sort of technical term for this is proleptic, and it means something like already, not yet. You heard this term? Already, not yet. It's both. It's already the kingdom of heaven, but it's not yet the fullness of the kingdom of heaven. So that's the first reason that it may not seem like it to you. And obviously, the world is still going on, doing all these horrible things, technology, etc. So you're getting a foretaste of the kingdom of heaven. But the second reason is that you're not fully real yet. This is where the title of the book comes into play. Because we are fallen, we are in the image of God, but not in the likeness of God. We fall prey to the passions, we sin, and we're not therefore fully human. Now, why might that be? So I will, maybe a little abstract, ask me to elaborate more comments, but in the comments, see, forget what we're talking in the Q&A. If God is the architect, if He is being itself, if He is reality itself, and He's also goodness itself, then to be more good is to draw closer to Him, to be aligned with goodness, He who is goodness itself. But if He's also reality itself, to draw closer to Him means to draw closer to reality, to become more real. So to be more morally good, on orthodoxy, is the same as to be more real, to be more in line with what God is. So when we sin, the problem with sin is not that God's angry, He's going to smite the up. That's Jericho covenant again. Oh, you lied. Write that down. I'm going to heaven. This is not what we're talking about. We're saying when you sin, you're falling out of alignment with He who is goodness itself. You're less good. That's what sin is. But by being less good, you're also less real. So if you draw further away from goodness through immoral action, you become less and less real. You become less fully human. So that's why immorality is so threatening, because it threatens who you really are. So the more you practice virtue, the more you become who you are in its fullness, the more you become fully real, the more you become like God. But because we're distinct from God, we're persons, and from each other, to become closer to God is to become more who you are, uniquely and distinctly, as told by God. So moral action, that's the formula. Moral action equals becoming more real. That's a main reason why you want to stop sinning, because you want to be more who you are. And I think you know this, right? We all have these really bad days. You're frustrated, you're angry, you're hungry, you're tired, right? You're not yourself. And you snap at people that you love, and you're a mess. And it's like, you don't feel like yourself. You're less real. You're less in control of yourself. You're less of who you could be. And then you have other days where you're just on top of it, you're generous, you're patient, you're kind to people when they're mean to you. You feel more whole. You feel more who you are. I think we experience it. So I end this by saying, what we're talking about, therefore, with the kingdom of heaven is not the place where, and I heard this from a Sunday school teacher when I was very little, well, heaven is the place where you can do whatever you want forever. But don't do anything you want now. You better behave, Don't eat sweets instead of dinner when you're older. Don't have premarital sex. Don't binge on video games. Don't have fun. But when you go to heaven, you get to do that forever. I mean, it's weird. It's defining heaven in terms of these weird earthly or hedonistic or pleasure-based terms. It's not about pleasure and pain exactly. That's not the point. The point is the kingdom of heaven is reality itself. by extension, this world is not fully real yet, just like you're not fully real yet, but you're becoming real. And that's, in a certain sense, when my Catholic college was poking me about this at dinner the other day, he was like, well, why don't Orthodox deny about this? And I said, well, we do. I mean, have you ever heard of Russia, for example? It wasn't a nation before it was Christian. But not in the same way. We're not trying to fix the world. We're trying to fix ourselves. Because the world is not our project. Like, becoming human is our project. And the kingdom of heaven is now. It's here and it's coming. So the point is to become part of that through participation, through invitation, through confession, through the sacraments. That's how you become human. That's how you enter the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven is the perfect form of government. The kingdom of heaven is the only total government. And you sort of waste your energy trying to force Earth to look like that. And the people who seem to be most utopian to me are always people who are least interested in doing the hard work of fixing it themselves. They want to impose that onto everyone. So that's kind of how all of this fits together. Okay? Good. I know it was kind of loud. Any questions, comments, or objections? Yes, sir.
Could you talk more about the sacramental way to view perception and passage of time, right? Because we experience time in a sequential, similar way, and yet archaic being transcendent to creation would be either like parallel, like quantum computing or some sort of alien way altogether, and yet in Old Testament, Son of God lived life seemingly in a sequential way, right? Being one place at one time, doing things in order, traveling by food and stuff. And in Old Testament, we see things like God regretting creating humans, which in regret implies like some sort of surprise, right? Some sort of unknown, some sort of unfolding of events.
Yeah.
So is that like the Son, the person using the incarnate property to experience time sequentially? Or something like that, because I'm trying to see some sort of pattern here where, for example, son of Jacob in prison, right? When he interpreted the dreams, and there was like 3 baskets and then 3 cows or whatever, it didn't cross my mind where he would go and translate it into sequentially. He'd be like, no, it's not 7 like alternatives or whatever, it's 7 years or 3 days or whatever. And then it's like, is that how it is? Is that how prophets like translate? Where kind of like God in parallel exhausts every possibility simultaneously outside of time, and we have to lead them through and one at a time. Or is there a more useful metaphor you would share?
Yeah, so there's this text that I haven't read that is on my list where the author is an Orthodox scholar and he argues that time comes into existence with the fall because we need time to repent and live this sequential life. And I haven't evaluated that, but some people talk about it. I'm not sure about that. But the main thing that I say to people about this is this whole idea that, oh, there's time, we have a law for this, and then God exists outside of time, and it's all, like, that's all very Catholic. In a certain sense, they're trying to build the perfect system to model reality exactly. I don't think that's something we can actually do because it assumes that this reality is more than it is. This reality isn't fully real yet. And when you read the saints, weird things happen. They prophesy, they do clairvoyance, time starts to run over itself in odd ways. Is that a function of the incarnation? Not certain. But we have prophecy before, which applies sequential time. But the other elements in your question is, well, the Old Testament texts are written in a certain way to fit the mythic genre of the people at that time. So it doesn't. The language it uses can be anthropomorphic. Obviously, pre-incarnation, God the Father. Doesn't. If he doesn't, Moses saw his backside. The Father doesn't have a back. so this kind of God regrets making man. I mean, this is sort of poetic language. Right? So you have to, that's that element to your question. But I don't have an answer. I don't know how time works. But my suspicion is that I wouldn't over worry about trying to get an exact model for a situation that isn't fully real yet. So I'm not a scientist, so it doesn't keep me awake. Yes, sir.
In your book, you mentioned that, I think you used the example of Civil War reenactments are kind of the ultimate form of imitation.
Oh, what?
Of imitation. How would you contrast an imitation in that kind of secular sense versus the kind of participation that happens during liturgy? Is there a gap there? And what would that be?
Yeah, so reenactors, Civil War reenactors, or Renaissance fairs, reenactment is one thing, and I say that that's fine. You're trying to reenact something that you're not part of. So there has to be something you participate in. There has to be something you enter into, and that was kind of the example I gave for certain types of other religions, where the analogy I gave was, let's say there's this family, and you want to be part of that family. You can't become part of that family by just reading text, which is kind of the Protestant attempt. It's like, if you got all the emails and all the texts and all the letters and diary entries of this family, you read them all, you could reenact that family's life. But you don't become a part of that family, because becoming a part of that family, you can't become a part of a family by reenacting or by copying the things that they say or repeating their jokes. But people do become part of the families who aren't born into them by marriage and by even by being family friends, but that involves physical participation. So for what's going on, so the answer is something like religion therefore requires a physical sacramental element. Because agreeing with the teachings of Jesus doesn't mean being a Christian to us. Being a Christian means you are baptized, you take the Eucharist, you're physically part of the church. Otherwise, if I just agree with these things, that's not religion. That's why religion must have a physical element to it. Well, there's people there. Hi. Yes, sir.
Just trying to think about kind of time the two talks together a little bit. I used to consider myself a classical liberal in the vein of Thomas Jefferson, so to speak, right? Very American, very proud of it and all that. I think in line with what you said earlier, I don't necessarily see myself that way anymore, regulars of it. If recovery, so to speak, of Western civilization is not the answer, from a practical perspective, how you said, don't read the news, you're the best person in it, which is great, obviously true, but some other examples of practical way, how do we more closely moved to reality in this extremely, secular, almost economic culture and time we live in.
Yeah, and that's the question. Obviously, the first part of that is you have to become human for you to be anything at all. If you're passionate, full of love, then that just makes change. I was talking to somebody there was this mom saying he was like arguing with this person, and somebody afterwards he said, "How did you not get so upset?" And I was just praying for the entire time. And the guy, he said nothing, and the guy was talking, and the guy there just started calming down. And they all went fine. And the same thing is happening. So that's a real thing that changes people, and people can feel this thing. you guys know, preach the gospel, always sometimes use words when necessary. You become a way, and that radiates out. That's not the practice for people, because you're all working on it, so that's good. But what do you do practically? And I think the answer in this culture is make Orthodox spaces and be artistic. So what do I mean by that? You know, there's all of these ways that a religious subculture can exist within a larger culture that's hostile to it. Make Orthodox spaces, make Orthodox schools, send your kids to Orthodox schools, hire Orthodox people for your businesses, and build a network of people that is a community that can withstand all of these secular pressures. So my parish started a parish school, K-12 school, in the last 5-6 years ago, because we realized you can't send kids to public school in California. You can't send kids to public school in California. It's not happening. So we started a parish school. We said, oh, there's all these young people want to date, get married. We built a outside tiki bar on the hill on our property for them to be able to chat and get to know each other. So we're making spaces that are our spaces. You can't assume that the secular world is neutral. At every level, it's in their range to be deeply hostile to religion in general and Orthodox in particular. So make spaces, make networks. The way that one of my friends put it, which also helps with catechism, he says, you know, look at Orthodox Jews. What do? They're diaspora. They're all over. They have these very tight networks. They hire each other. They make their own, Jewish yacht club, Jewish whatever. It's like that's how you create a thing that's in a culture, but not of a culture. That's strong. That's resilient to things that happen in the culture that may want to destroy it. Don't just send your kids to public school and then throw them off to college. Give them a smartphone, send them to college, and think like that. You have to make that world for them to live in that allows them to be Christian.
Could you elaborate a little bit more? I don't know a lot about Catholicism. Why does it go firmly in secular? Because they have the sacraments, yes. So why would you not put them in the sacramental world?
Yeah, there's a lot of ink has been spilled about why exactly this happens. It's kind of a big argument among academics. But one of the answers that I liked was that there's just a different way of conceptualizing these things in the West that kind of leads to all the movements I talked about. So again, Father John Strickland, he wrote a 4-volume church history series on this. His thesis is there's 2 elements to God. There's the transcendent God, he's the archaic, he's completely not like us at all. But then there's also the immanence of God, meaning the closeness. He becomes incarnate, he's here, you can go to heaven, you live in the foretaste, you come to liturgy. Immanence is necessary for you to do what we do here and participate in Kingdom of Heaven. But our religion is not totally immanent, because obviously it's not just earthly, it's connected to this transcendent God. But it's not merely transcendent because it becomes incarnate and is participating in it physically. So Father Strickland says his concern is that in the West, the balance went too much towards the transcendence of God and not enough towards the immanence. They kind of started, the immanence part weakened. That's why there's not really icons like look around. You're surrounded by human faces. They're present, they're gold, they're bright. These things happened, and they're happening now all the time. On Pascha, you say Christ, you'll say Christ has risen. See, Christ is risen because that event happens now. It's eternally present. The liturgical calendar is not reminding you of what happened. You're participating in what happened all throughout time and space. It's all here in the church. So that immanence is why we have all these icons. Why I think that's why we have American clergy. Because they're here, they're incarnate, they're rooted, they're children of their children of the parish. And Catholics, mainly, pretty much, I mean, there's Easter Catholic, but the Roman Rite is No, they're all monks. They're all celibates. There's this removal between the clergy and the laity because there's this overemphasis on the transcendence of God and not enough on the immanence. And I think Father Strickland would say over time that weakens to the point where you get Protestantism, questioning some or all the sacraments. It gets more secular as it goes, then you get Latin humanism, then you get this culture. And so his concern is that they lose, for whatever reason, this immanence part of the formula. People have disputed that, academics and all that forever. So that makes sense to me. Yes, sir.
We touch upon miracles in the context of the discussion around having physical elements, spiritual elements, and everything around us. And I would like you to elaborate on this a bit more. The motivation coming from two sources. One, the miracles we did in the Bible. Lazarus was resurrected, Christ. And when we share in conversations with non-Christian, or non-Christian, even non-Orthodox, that becomes difficult to explain and compel somebody to accept. But there is another type of miracle which is happening all the time actually today, and that explains the persistence of the church for thousands of years. When we have had the experience, many of us and many of the people around us, where let's say I want something to happen, and I persist and I try very hard, and it doesn't happen, and then we pray for a year, and then it happens. And you say, that cannot be an accident, because that was such an unlikely event to happen. I was trying so hard. But on the other hand, again, what is the understanding or the theology behind something like that, and how could I relate to this happen? These two types of miracles.
well, I'm going to try to answer the question under that, I think, which is, if you are a Western person or grew up in under any kind of Western influence, then the way, how do you think about the physical world? You think, well, there are these laws of physics. If I drop something, the law of gravity makes it fall. If I boil water, the chemical processes make it. So we have this mechanistic explanation of how reality works. We think we know, well, gravity causes things to fall, and inertia causes things to keep going, and friction causes them to slow. Those are all the causes. And we build this kind of scientific world that has many causes. And a very oversimplified way of saying this is that you don't have to think about cause in that way. You could just say that every single thing has one cause. God. Like all of it is an unfolding of Christ the Logos. And so a miracle is not God pausing the laws of physics and changing it and then unpausing and letting it run again. It's that everything is kind of this continual unfolding of God. Now, then the follow-up question is, well, how do we even understand how human free will plays into all of that? You do things, and God is willing it, and there's not a mechanistic kind of formula for how that works. We don't know. I don't even really know how that happens. But rather than saying, who knows, and shrugging, I would rather say, I think the Orthodox feeling is more that everything is this unfolding of the love of God. And the way you draw closer to how things really work is through repenting, becoming real, and through the sacraments. And then as they unfold, it all becomes glory. For example, like every single thing that happens, you say, thank God, to God be the glory. If that's a good thing happening or a bad thing happening. And the martyrs are brutally tortured, and so many of their times they're full of joy. Because nothing can happen to you, however bad it seems to us, that can't be caught up into the unfolding love of God. That's a little abstract, but that's the sense that I get from all these things.
we've discussed the reality of life, God in the life of the Orthodox Church, which is a stark contrast to the method of healing, living, that sort of thing that we have in the secularized world. Can you put a contrast between our understanding and our experience and modern psychology's approach?
Yeah, so we're actually going to do a 6-episode series on psychology, probably in 2 series from now, where we're at the podcast. And there's 2 things I noticed about this. One is that psychology is kind of a new discipline, let's say, relative to the disciplines of the ancient world. And I just noticed that it comes into the world in the 20th century, kind of right about the time that the West needs a new religion with confession and healing and all this therapeutic language, replaces a lot of the sacraments way. There's been a lot of written poking at the psychoanalytic movement, where it's like, yeah, you come for your confession once a week, you confess your sins to your priest, and it all weirdly looks like this kind of secularization of religion. And there's this wonderful book that I just started by Mother Silouana. It's called God, Where is the Moon? And she, okay, give some thumbs up. And she basically addresses a lot of these points about modern psychology and its limitations, and what the Orthodox alternative to healing is. And I'll just end with this, which
What's
is
the name of the book?
God, Where is the Wound? By Mother Silouana.
We've had it here a few times, probably maybe not now. If we're not, probably will be.
Yeah.
We'll get more copies.
And I'm just struck by so I shot video at somebody's memory, and it was somebody going around talking to psychologists and psychiatrists, and he put the microphone in front of them and said, how many patients have you cured in psychiatry? And one of the guys just laughed, and that was the entire clip. And then another guy said, maybe one, and another person said, there are no cures with psychology. That's not how this works. That's a weird question. And the perpetuation of negativity and different problems and different deeper problems. I mean, I'm not saying these things aren't helpful to people in various moments of time, but that if the thrust of the discipline is not towards healing the soul and body, then it makes a lot of sense to me that it should culturally emerge at a point where it's trying to fulfill the needs of the sacramental culture that doesn't exist anymore. But I recommend that book. It's way better than whatever else. Thank you.
With that, thank you, Zachary. Let's put all this in prayer, practice in prayer, right?
Turn off the lecture, go to rest.
Yes.